Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with my old friend from the Financial Times, Edward Luce. He has a new biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's a wonderful book. I actually just finished it. The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet. It's called Zbig. And as a biography, it tells us so much about America, perhaps a little less about Zbig. And we're back, Zbig being a particularly interesting character who spans American diplomatic history. We're back to biography today with a very different character to Zbig. William Buckley, my guest, is Sam Tanenhaus. He's written an even bigger biography of Buckley than Luce wrote about Zbig. It's called Buckley, The Life and Revolution That Changed America. And Sam Tanenhaus is joining us from his home in Connecticut. Sam, congratulations on the book. It's quite an achievement. How many pages is it?
Well, the text, the narrative is about 850 pages, and the notes are another 100. Then there's an index. So altogether, it's about 1,000 pages. It's a big book.
It is quite a big book. Well, he was a big man, wasn't he? And it goes together with your biography of Whittaker Chambers, another very prominent American conservative. Are you a conservative, Sam? Is this a labor of love, or you're just intrigued by Buckley himself?
No, I'm not a conservative in the current definition of one, or really any American definition of one. I'm not a big fan of those labels anyway. I think most of us have conservative impulses and radical and liberal ones as well. But I'm fascinated by these great, larger than life conservative intellectuals in particular, and the way their lives have intersected with history. They're really books about men of words and ideas, and ask the question whether they really make a difference in the lives the rest of us lead. And when their actual experiences take them onto the historical and political stage, that really interests me, because it's so different from my own life, which is a kind of retiring and invisible one. And the idea that people who live by their intellects can actually affect the tides of history fascinates me. I don't know if I have a good answer to whether they really do, by the way. But at times it seemed they did. First Chambers and now Buckley. And that's what I wanted to look at.
Is the business of biography, particularly when you're writing the biography of somebody like Buckley, who's so defiantly political in every sense, is it by definition a political act? I mean, you could have written this book with the subtitle "The Life of a Man That Didn't Change America." Isn't there a kind of conservative narrative here that great men change history, in reverse to the old, I don't know, progressive or even Marxist narrative on history that events, structures, social classes determine the nature of things?
Well, I actually am intrigued by both ideas. I don't see that one has to exclude the other. And I'm trying to think who it is. I've done a number of interviews, and one historian I talked to said that one of the interesting, to him at least, strains in the book is that it tries to address the question in both ways. That is to say, can you take a really prominent public figure? Buckley's innovation, by the way, was to see that media itself could become the instrument for a kind of theatrical presentation of history. And that proved to be really prescient. And that's what we're living with now, is politics as a kind of theater and even entertainment. And if you could take that notion, a very large, ambitious, really gifted person who lived through much of the 20th century, born in 1925, died in 2008. We are approaching his centennial. Whether someone who did view the world that way could use the instruments at his disposal to have some kind of impact. I think even a devout Marxist would say that Marx himself made a difference. Buckley himself would have said it about Marx and about others as well. So I don't see those really as exclusive approaches to telling stories, which is really what I do, write narratives that try to bring these opposites together. I like the dialectical approach, if that doesn't sound too pretentious, of bringing opposites together and see what the interaction is.
Sam, we jumped in the deep end, or I pushed you in the deep end. Not that you don't know how to swim here, but for our viewers and listeners who don't know much about Buckley, tell us about him. Why is he such an important and interesting figure?
Well, he was born, as I said, in 1925 in a quite wealthy family. A family of his father was a self-made lawyer and oil speculator who won and lost fortunes in both Mexico and Venezuela during the great oil boom years of the 1920s. Buckley was raised with 9 siblings in a very large, beautiful estate near the Berkshires in what's called the northwest corner of Connecticut. Then he attended Yale, became famous while an undergraduate at Yale. After brief service in World War II, he did not see combat, was himself an ardent America firster, another reason for the relevance of his story today, and then became really the most articulate and impassioned proponent of anti-communism. He attacked his alma mater in a famous book, still his most famous book, called God and Man at Yale, which makes arguments that absolutely presage the arguments being made against Ivy League and elite institutions today. That the faculty are leftists, that the students are being indoctrinated, that there is no free speech, that speech is actually controlled and limited by a liberal elite. All these arguments Buckley presciently laid out in his first book. Prescient because they became useful for the political mission he was on. And then he adopted anti-communism as his great cause for many years. So he was a champion of Senator Joseph McCarthy, wrote a book about him, and then founded a magazine, National Review, which is still with us. Founded it in 1955. And it was the first serious, ambitious political journal, a weekly, to come out of the American right. And as I say, is published and read to this day, not with the influence it once had, but it had influence all through Buckley's life. So in the period when conservatives began to ascend in the American debate and to win elections, figures like Barry Goldwater, who was nominated for the presidency in 1964, and then later Ronald Reagan in 1980, both friends, colleagues, and tutees of William Buckley. He and others in his orbit were really their preceptors, their teachers, instructed them in the idea of what an American conservative movement might look like in these middle years of the 20th century. Buckley became ever more prominent, particularly with the foundation, the forming of his famous television interview program, Firing Line, which started in 1966 and remained on the air amazingly until 1999 on public television for most of those years. Buckley was not a conservative who objected to public television. In that period, Buckley became the most famous voice and face of conservatism in America. And even, I think, for much of that time, probably the single most famous intellectual in the country. That is, he was the guy you knew if you saw him on the street, you recognized him. Far greater figures were not as well known. Buckley was. So there was always an aspect of celebrity and entertainment to his ideological mission, and that's what helped it to succeed.
Another excellent biography we've dealt with on the show is Beverly Gage's book on J. Edgar Hoover, which looks at Hoover's life. She doesn't get inside his head, or I don't think she really tries to get inside his head. But of course, there are lots of questions about Hoover's life, his relationships, his sexuality. Was the public and the private Buckley, Sam, were they rather different figures? You present him as a very public man. He was a public man. He reinvented politics and television. He certainly modernized American conservatism. But were there lots of questions about Buckley, private questions that people gossiped about, that didn't know much about? One of the striking things about Ed's book on Brzezinski is that he didn't seem to have much of a private life. He didn't womanize. He was a loyal husband. He was a good parent.
Well, Buckley was all those things, but he also had an extremely active private and social life. Buckley was really a kind of high society figure. He and his wife, Pat, who for a number of years, in the 1980s particular, was the reigning socialite in Manhattan. They were very public figures, but at the same time, as you suggest, there were always questions about what Buckley's real identity might be. And this emerged in some famous public episodes. Probably the best known was his debate with Gore Vidal, who was a rival and enemy. Buckley actually
was that was in 1968, wasn't it?
1968, during the they debated actually a dozen times, but it's one debate everyone remembers. The debates were held during that tumultuous election of 1968. And for those of us who fear, and there are many, we've entered the darkest age in modern American history, I recommend you read the pages in my book and others on the 1968 presidential election, in which two of the greatest figures in American public life were assassinated, Dr. Martin Luther King and Senator Robert Kennedy, and in which there were uprisings and riots in as many as 1,000 municipalities, including at the two presidential nominating conventions in Miami, where the Republicans convened, and then in Chicago, where the Democrats met. And it was during the Chicago demonstration, which led to a police riot, as it was officially described by a report, that Buckley and Vidal, who were meeting each night on ABC television for 15 minutes of debate, got into a really notorious name-calling exchange. And I think we're uncensored here, so I can say
you certainly can.
Okay, that Vidal called Buckley a crypto Nazi, and Buckley said, "Don't call me a Nazi, you queer, or I'll sock you in the goddamn face." And Buckley, who prided himself on his ultra refined use of language, found himself in the gutter in this exchange. It was memorable, and it was also disturbing to him. And the feud with Vidal continued in the pages of Esquire magazine. They sued one another, became quite a public spectacle of just the kind Buckley didn't want. But what it really hinged on, Andrew, was this suggestion that Buckley himself was a closeted gay man, as Vidal was at that point, by the way. Vidal was not openly gay in the expression we use now. There was almost no such thing in that period, the late 60s. This is almost 60 years ago. So the name calling became a kind of metaphor for this suppressed quality in Buckley's life and persona that people wondered about, and that I do explore in some detail in this book, because it led him to other places too. Another extraordinary episode in his life was Buckley's championing of a convicted death row inmate in the Trenton, New Jersey state prison, who was facing execution, and no one on earth thought this man, Edgar Smith, was innocent except William F. Buckley, who actually helped get him released after years of effort, thousands of dollars spent on legal appeals. He sponsored Smith's literary career. Smith was a talented writer. It's one reason Buckley was drawn to him. And then a few years after Smith was released, Buckley had taken up the case in the early 60s. Smith was released in 1971. And in 1976, he almost murdered somebody a second time. Came within an inch of killing her. Buckley was amazingly unrepentant. He said he'd been taken in by Smith, but Buckley himself had done nothing wrong. And it astounded him when much of the world saw this very differently. And that, to me, seemed an illuminating episode in the life and mind of William Buckley. That in the sense he was so persuaded of his own higher purpose and his kind of irradiating innocence, much of it the result of his truly devout Catholicism, that he thought he could bestow a kind of innocence on Edgar Smith, you see. And so in that sense, there's a very complicated life. Let me add one thing here, Andrew, and then we'll go on. The surprise for me writing about Buckley was how complicated he was. My first subject, Whittaker Chambers, was supposed to be the complicated, tormented Dostoevskian figure. Buckley was not Dostoevskian and not tormented at all, but that's where the complication began. He spread himself in so many areas, lived a life with so many dimensions. It was kind of protean figure that he ends up being far more complicated than I had realized.
Do you think that your book about him would he have been capable of writing this kind of book? I mean, how reflective was he? How honest? I know you spent some time with him. I'm not sure how official this biography is. He's no longer around. He wouldn't have been uncomfortable about you writing his biography. But would he have been capable of this level of analysis, of insight? I mean, obviously, when it comes to some of his secrets, he probably wouldn't have been quite as revealing. But what does, in other words, what does the biographer bring that an autobiographer couldn't do?
He wanted me to write it. Now, it was my idea to do it, and also William Buckley's son, Christopher, the brilliant novelist and humorist. They both wanted me to do it. There were others who wanted to write the book, and there were other books about him that had been written. But so it's not authorized in the sense, it's often called authorized, and the shorthand use of that term can apply here. In other words, Buckley fully participated in it, approved of the project, and helped me in any way I asked. If I needed an introduction, he gave me the introduction. He gave me unrestricted, exclusive access to all his voluminous papers, not realizing there was a whole other set of papers his brother had kept in South Carolina, where the family also lived. And that's some of the news in the book. Probably the most important news is Buckley's family's secret history of involvement with segregationists during the first civil rights era of the
Which probably didn't massively surprise you, did it?
Well, that he favored the white South was not news. We knew that his family actually sponsored the publication of a newspaper that supported the White Citizens Council did surprise me because Buckley had kept it secret. He never told anyone. In the South, it was well known. In the country was still divided enough, and the communications systems were less all-pervasive, that a family could actually have a life in the South that was not explored in the North. Today, if he owned that newspaper, we would all know about it, right? And in fact, you can read publications in the South that referred to it and to the Buckley family's involvement in it. But it was never mentioned in the North. It's quite remarkable. But was Buckley capable of this kind of reflection? Absolutely not. And that's why he wanted me to do it. What he liked about the Chambers book was not that it was respectful of Chambers, though it was, but that it showed Chambers in larger dimensions. It wasn't simply Chambers who was most famous for having been the witness for the prosecution, as it were, in the Alger Hiss perjury and spy case, the early Cold War, a very important episode. Historically, a much more important one than the Rosenberg trial, though the Rosenberg trial had the more horrific, shocking conclusion. The Hiss trial was the one that really...
Yeah, we had Tony. Do you know Tony Hiss, his son, prominent environmentalist? He was on the show a few years ago.
Yes, and he grew up in the shadow of that case. His father was sent to prison, and Chambers was the principal witness in that case. He'd been his assistant.
I know, Sam, you touched in the book on Buckley's supposed anti-Semitism as well. And of course, the issue of race, which you just talked about. He was also involved in a very famous debate with James Baldwin. Do you think it's helpful in these kinds of biographies of a man of the intellectual stature of Buckley, even if he wasn't perhaps primarily an intellectual, to be concerned about whether he was a racist or an anti-Semite?
Do you ask if it's appropriate? Well,
if it's not so much appropriate, but it seems. I mean, conservatives, of course, these days have their own obsession with this and woke and all the rest of it. But for a biographer, is it the kind of thing when you began this project you wondered, is Buckley really a racist? Is he really an anti-Semite? Is that a good, useful question for a biographer to ask?
Well, sure. I mean, they're inescapable questions for a biographer to ask, especially if one subject is the intellectual leader of one of the two or three most effective political movements in America in the 20th century. You know, the others being the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. The third would be the conservative movement. In my view, I mean, there are others that are very important. Environmentalism, one you mentioned, that's not really a political movement in the same way. This is because political movements are about power, right? We know all the way from Machiavelli on, and Buckley was very well schooled in a Machiavellian approach to politics because one of his mentors, James Burnham, had written brilliantly about Machiavelli and the sources of power. So if you're writing about someone who means to lead a revolution, and that's what he called it. That's not a term that I'm imposing on Buckley. He called himself both a radical conservative and a counter-revolutionary. And in that sense, when some of the great issues in America involved religion and race, it's inescapable to deal with them. I do know some readers, particularly conservatives, are a little surprised at the depth of Buckley's involvement in these issues and how much of it went back to his family. I can say William Buckley's son, Christopher, was quite surprised by the depth.
Was he embarrassed?
I think worse than that. Yeah, I think he was appalled by it. And yet he felt that in order for his father's life to be seen in its wholeness and its importance, that those facets needed to be recognized, because in both cases, Andrew, to a surprising extent, Buckley came around, certainly on anti-Semitism, although it took the 1967 Arab-Israeli War for him to do it. Up until then, he was not an enemy of Israel and Jews, but he was quite skeptical. For his generation, now we're really getting into some history here. For people who came of age when Buckley did, Israel seemed a kind of extension of the left-wing labor movement come out of
which it was in some ways.
Which it was, yeah, absolutely it was.
But so some people might be thinking to themselves, well, when the smoke clears on this supposed sophisticated conservatism, what you have with Buckley is just another racist, another guy who is somehow mourning the Civil War and wants to put blacks back in their place, and perhaps Jews as well. Is there any truth to that?
It's a plausible argument. I think because Buckley was so large and good a person, we've said very little about that. I've said very little about that. He was extraordinarily charitable and philanthropic. And in face-to-face dealings with almost anyone, he was exceptionally humane. And this grew out of his truly devout Catholicism. Andrew Sullivan, whom you probably know, talked about the book, that one thing that really struck him was how Buckley really tried to live the life that a Catholic is told every Sunday at Mass to try to live, to be a good neighbor, to be charitable, to be helpful, be philanthropic. Buckley did all those things with black and white people alike. You know, he was a donor to historically black universities and colleges. Part of his problem was everything got turned into ideology. Another one of Buckley's great friends for a long time, his most brilliant protege turned apostate, Buckley's term, was the great historian Garry Wills. Got very close to in the writing of this book. Not to be confused with George Will, who was also a Buckley protege, but the historian and religious and political thinker Garry Wills. And he said Buckley was simply the most charitable man you would meet, that he had ever known. And he said, I love everything about Bill Buckley, but it's crazy reactionary politics. If you just get rid of those, there isn't a better man to be around. And we live in a moment when it seems almost impossible to disentangle those personae. How can you have what we consider absolutely unacceptable, rebarbative, repellent political opinions and also be a fine person? We find it really difficult to hold those contradictions in our minds at the same time. That's what is very rich, I think, about Buckley. You cannot reconcile them. They are both aspects of his character and personality and what made him, as I say, so complicated. It is possible, certainly, to say, well, this was just a very genteel, articulate, well-spoken, reactionary racist. You know, now he overcame a lot of the racism later, and as early as 1970, he said America needs a black president. Once he met someone face to face, like Jesse Jackson, who really impressed him, Muhammad Ali, both guests on his great show Firing Line, as were Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. So there's a media historian, very good one, named Heather Hendershot, who says if you want to know what Bobby Seale, or in particular Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, the leaders of the Black Panthers, really had to say back in the late 60s and early 1970s, you have to watch Buckley's show Firing Line because he had them on and let them speak. So there was that kind of embracing curiosity Buckley had. He had a genuine curiosity about people and their lives, their ideas. He didn't care if you were rich or poor, but he wanted to know what you thought, what you read, what your tastes were. And someone else I've written about wrote a profile of him when I was at Vanity Fair magazine, Cornel West, and got to know him quite well.
Yeah, I know Cornel.
Yeah, he loved Buckley. Buckley had him on his program.
Well, Cornel is also a character. I know he spoke recently at the recent Libertarian conference. He defies political categories.
He really does, and it's one reason he liked Buckley.
I wonder, the more you talk about Buckley, Sam, I know you want to make him a contemporary figure because of what's happening in America today, and that goes without saying, and the theatrical nature of politics and all the rest of it. But the more you talk about him, the more he appears to me, at least, to be a figure from a a previous age, an elite. He went to Yale. He debated with his Yale and Harvard friends. He blew up Yale from the inside, but he was still a Yale guy. He's from a wealthy Catholic family. In historical terms, is that period over, the period of elites? I mean, if Buckley was around today, I'm sure everyone asks this question. I'm guessing that he would be in many ways very uncomfortable with our TikTok, YouTube, Instagram world where everyone has the same platform to express themselves.
You know, I can't answer that question for myself or anyone else because Buckley was so facile and so quick with his responses and retorts. I have a feeling once he got on what used to be called Twitter, it was now X, he never would have gotten off.
Well, he would have been like Trump, I would have guessed, in that sense.
Yeah, or Elon Musk. You know, he wrote almost every day. He had a column. He wrote 3 columns a week. Now, we have very good columnists today, and they tend to write once or twice a week. Buckley wrote 3. These were the days when newspapers were still the main platform for news. And his column was syndicated in some 360 papers at his peak, which meant he reached, in theory, tens of millions of readers, was on television. All of this he was very comfortable with. He liked, it's true, a kind of high table style, almost a kind of Oxbridge high table style. That's why I found some of the most amused, kind of entertained reviews of my book have been in the English press, The Economist and The Telegraph, the Prospect, various magazines. Those reviewers understand Buckley's eccentricity and kind of like that high style he had. But I think you ask a really good question, whether that is simply gone. What we have as successors to Buckley are Ivy League graduates of a different sort. J.D. Vance and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and others are all Ivy Leaguers, as Buckley was.
Most of them went to Yale.
Most of them went to Yale, and Buckley was an outsider in one important way. He was a Catholic when there was a quota placed on Catholics at Yale. The same quota as was placed on Jews, 13%. There were so few black people, you didn't even have to bother to count them. They were not getting in. So Buckley was a kind of inside-outside figure. You mentioned my friend Beverly Gage, the great historian. And she tells me, she's also, as you know, a Yale professor. She tells me what she finds most interesting about Buckley is he was a kind of inside-outside figure, she calls them. So here he is denouncing the Ivy League, but doing it from within the Ivy League. He's denouncing the elites, but he belongs to the most elite clubs.
I mean, there's a quality of Bannon. I mean, the contemporary figure who somehow comes to mind, would be Steve Bannon. He certainly doesn't have Buckley's looks, Buckley, I assume, shaved every day. But is there a Bannonite quality, or was there, to Buckley?
There was, although I would think someone else I've written about, Patrick Buchanan, I think, comes a little closer to Bannon. I think in terms of argument, the heirs to Buckley today, not necessarily in the refinement, kind of verbal refinement, but in their understanding of where the power aligns in the culture and how to criticize elites, I would look at people like Barry Weiss and Christopher Rufo, not simply because they're critics of the university, obviously, which they are, but because they're entrepreneurs in the way Buckley was. Buckley was a real ideological entrepreneur and performer. And I think they are too. They realize that you can do this in a public way and attract the attention and tentative interest of people who disagree with you. That was Buckley's big gamble.
But there was more to it, Sam, than that. I mean, Weiss worked at the New York Times. She knows the ideological formalities, shall we say, of that world. You were there too, so you're all too familiar with that.
Yes.
Buckley had I mean, whether or not you're a conservative, he did have a point, didn't he?
Buckley?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely he did. And the point is, and this is where I think Barry Weiss and Chris Rufo were onto something too. The point is not the heresies, if you're a conservative, that are being imposed on the young. You know, what are they teaching our kids? It's the institutional concealment and the unacknowledged orthodoxy of those worldviews. That's what Buckley saw very early on. So in God, Man at Yale, for instance, he says that he has a subtitle of the book, very clever. It's The Superstitions, he says, of Academic Freedom, which is an ingenious subtitle because it implies that the objectivity and neutrality, sort of the higher plane of argument, is itself a kind of dogma. And that's what Buckley saw. And that Yale wasn't owning up to it. So his audience was really alumni and donors, just as they are for this new generation. They realize that they can expose what the great institutions don't admit is actually going on in their campus.
They were telling the truth, and Buckley was very good at that, at tearing away the dogma or the dishonesty, the formalities. What about a more concrete intellectual legacy? You said that the English like this book. I mean, given our history of Burkean conservatism, it's not surprising. And there is a Burkean quality to Buckley. But does he leave an intellectual legacy as a conservative? I've always, I mean, the contradiction in terms, of course, of American conservatism goes without saying. It's something you're all too familiar with. You've written your book about Chambers as well. But did he discover anything different for American conservatives, or was he really just ultimately a theatrical bomb thrower who could point out the hypocrisy of liberals at Harvard and Yale?
That is a question I don't think I can really answer, because I don't write as a theorist. And I find, this will sound paradoxical given what I said at the beginning of our conversation, I find that while intellectuals have played a larger role in our public and political life than maybe they're often given credit for, it's not really because of the ideas and arguments. It's because of the talents of advocacy. You know, Nietzsche, I think, says in one of his books, I've been trying to track it down, said, don't look to the intellectuals to see the formations of tastes and fashions in a society. Look to the aristocrats. They're the tastemakers, and the intellectuals follow. I think to a great extent, even our best thinkers and writers are actually attaching themselves to individual politicians and causes. So if you look at one of Buckley's great antagonists and later friends, Buckley's enemies almost always eventually became his friends. He was too good company to, you know, you didn't want to turn down the invitation to his home, was Arthur Schlesinger, who was a few years older, was a great liberal. Well, if you look at Schlesinger's work, which I admire enormously, and I knew him and I respect him tremendously as a writer and journalist and historian, he's attaching himself to one politician or another, whether it's Franklin Roosevelt or later Adlai Stevenson, and finally, of course, the Kennedys. So intellectuals seek their place in this broader market, we'll call it. And I think Buckley understood that with rare insight. So when you read the best of Buckley, and a disappointment for me, listen, I think we both know this book has been very widely commented on. It's not surprising. It's a big book and it's a big subject. But one of the surprises to me, left and right, and in the middle, is how little is said about Buckley's other writing. It's the first book, God and Man at Yale, which I've brought up here, that's talked about, but not some of his great memoirs. The memoirs are a joy to read. And there you see Buckley living the life of an erudite Epicurean, somebody who's enjoying his life, and he's attuned to everything he sees. He spoke several languages. He read not as deeply and widely as the great thinkers did, but more than most of us do. He was acquainted with a very broad spectrum of American experience, and he's able to capture the pleasure and excitement of living that kind of life. And I think that's what's really gone away. I don't think, and that is what the legacy might be at some future point. There are always young Buckley acolytes among us, and they're attracted to the Buckley style. And I don't underrate and undervalue style. Oscar Wilde didn't, and Wilde was a model for this book. Wilde, two great Irishmen and their great biographer, Richard Ellman, lie behind this book, not to elevate myself and what I've done, but to give you some sense of how I thought of what I was doing, how I approached it. And these are figures, Joyce and Wilde, who through language lived in a very large way and changed the way other people spoke and wrote. And I think to some extent Buckley actually did that. I think there's a different sound. We're not hearing it at this particular moment, perhaps, but as recently as a few years ago, we were hearing a sound that came out of Buckley. And so there he holds a place maybe similar to someone like Tom Wolfe, who was his great friend, the journalist Tom Wolfe, or Gary Wills and George Will, people who bring the power of intellect to the scene they describe without embarrassment, and who assume that listeners and readers will respond to it.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it, Sam? It seems to me the more you talk about Buckley, obviously this conservative, also an aristocrat. You mentioned the word aristocracy a couple of times. His success as a human being, his identity, most of all, was as an American aristocrat. That was his upbringing. And yet, it's an idea that America was founded against, and yet he's supposed to be this founder, pioneer of American conservatism. We can't square that circle, can we?
No, we can't. And English wasn't even his first language. It was his third. He learned Spanish from nursemaids and French from living abroad before he spoke English at the age of 8. So no, in some ways, he's quite an anomalous figure. And that's why there was no one like him before. And I'll be surprised if we see someone like him since. But we also, as you know, are a country of individuals. And I think that's where Buckley resonates for us. His 100th anniversary is approaching. And so is the great novel that was published just a few months before he was born, Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And Buckley identified with Fitzgerald, another Irish Catholic romantic, we could say, with aristocratic pretensions at least, if not origins. Buckley was not born an aristocrat.
But Gatsby was so sad, and it's such a sad book, and it doesn't sound as if Buckley's life was sad.
Oh, in many ways it was. There are two epigraphs in the book, my book, one from Proust, one from Keats. The third I almost included is from The Great Gatsby. And I'm going to paraphrase it now because I don't have total recall. But it's something like, if personality is a series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. And then he goes on to say he had a romantic readiness, a hope, a kind of eternal hope. And I think that's the best of Buckley. And I think that hope coincided with faith and also the capacity for delusion. This is a book really about faith and delusion. That's why Proust was in some ways my model for how I thought about Buckley. And that's why we see Buckley taking up the wrong causes all the time. He wants to make them better than they really are. And you could say, well, that's it's a bad mission. Why make Joe McCarthy sound better than McCarthy was? Well, if you have a genuine belief in the evils of communism, of state-sponsored communism, we're talking about Stalin's Russia and Mao's China, those are serious cases to be presenting. And you'd like to do better than Joe McCarthy, But and that's where Buckley, the member of the big family, brought allies in, just the way the Kennedys did. The Buckley family was
right, and of course, Joe Kennedy was friendly with McCarthy, and Bobby Kennedy started I think his first job out of law school was with McCarthy. So It's complicated. And I know that we can't keep on going on. There's so much here. We'd go on for 950 pages, Sam. But I know the relations between Buckley and the Kennedys was also complex and interesting. Final question on this, and we'll have to get you back on the show because there's so much more to talk about here. You mentioned his great debate with in 1968. The year supposedly, I think someone wrote a book about this, in which the American dream died. Did Buckley have an American dream? And if he did, what was it?
It was a dream of restoration. And it began with his parents. Someone who knew Buckley well said what he wanted to do was to create an America his own parents would have been comfortable in. And that, Andrew, that's the world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, of entrepreneurialism, of laissez-faire economics, of the gospel of wealth, Andrew Carnegie's gospel of wealth, an age of philanthropy rather than government. It was a world that was doomed to fail because it destroyed itself. We couldn't live that way. You can't scale up personal kindness in a large country where people are working at miserable jobs and being exploited. Some of them are enslaved. You can't do it. You can't do it. Buckley refused to accept that. He really thought he and others like him could make a more tolerable world. And that is a powerful delusion, I think. I'm surprised by the extent to which many still can't give it up. And that's a part of our identity, of our historic identity. I may be writing about that in a future book.
Well, the more you talk about him, the more Sisyphean he seems, perhaps rooted or suited to the mythology of the ancients. Certainly an interesting character. I don't share his politics. I know you don't, but he's obviously a remarkable man. And congratulations, Sam. It's quite an achievement. I can't believe you're talking about another book. Most people who've written a 950-page biography would say, I'm never writing another book. But you clearly are not put off. What's the next book about?
Well, I'm choosing between a couple of projects now, but I want to look at democracy. I want to look at what democracy is.
Small subject. Maybe you'll need more than 950 pages on that one. But Sam Tanenhaus, real honor to have you on the show. I've always been an admirer of your work. You used to edit the New York review, not the New York Review of Books, but the New York Times Book Review. Wonderful writer, and you've gifted us, Sam, this enormously important biography of one of America's most interesting, complicated, frustrating, and inspiring figures, William Buckley. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure to talk with you. It was fun. Hope we do it again.